And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I'm your host, Demo, and this is 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks. Episode 16. Starting out this week with Vile Consumption. 1 a blue and a black enchantment. All creatures have, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this creature unless you pay 1 life. So just a really great sort of hating on creatures type of strategy. I've seen this card before in like an Aloro Pillowfort type deck. Sort of hates on creatures. I mean, obviously people can just pay, but it is a drain effect. It really drains heavy creature decks. And it does combine or pair really well with a, more of a Pillowfort strategy, right? So if you have a Ghostly Prison in play as well, because your opponent's going to be like, okay, well, I want to kill that guy first because he's killing me with his Vile Consumption. So pairing with a Ghostly Prison or a Pillowfort type of effect really works well. So it really does work good in decks like that. Coming in at number 2, Vidolian Illusionists. 2 and a blue Merfolk Wizard. 2/2. Pay a blue and tap. Target creature phases out. That's it. Just target creature phases out. And I've talked about phasing quite a bit in these videos. I think it's fantastic in Commander. The fact that you can phase your creature out makes it pretty much immune to anything, and then it safely phases back in on your turn. Also can be used on your opponent's creatures, right? This is just target creature phases out. There's so many ways to use this card, right? You can use it as a Maze of Ith type of effect where your opponent's Blightsteel Colossus just phases out and then they don't get to swing at you with it, right? You can use it to save your creatures. Vidolian Illusionist can save itself from getting removed. It's similar to a Mother of Runes in that regard, where it just sits on the table and you use it to protect your commander. And if someone tries to remove your Vidolian Illusionist first, you use it to protect itself. Like I use this in my Piran Toothy deck, because a lot of people will try to get your Toothy off the table before it gets a bunch of counters on it, and you can phase it out, right? Because phasing works great with +1/+1 counters as well. They'll come back into play with all those counters on them still. So it works great in a deck like that. Works great in an Ishe deck too for the same reason. There's just a lot of decks I think this card could go in. Coming in at number 3, Volcanic Offering. 4 and a red. Instant. Destroy target non-basic land you don't control and target non-basic land of an opponent's choice you don't control. Volcanic Offering deals 7 damage to target creature you don't control and 7 damage to a target creature of an opponent's choice you don't control. So again, this is an actual Commander card. It was printed in Commander 2014. Didn't really see much play. When I first saw it, I was like, man, this card's amazing. This is the kind of card that I think you actually have to play with it to understand how good it can be. This can be 5 mana instant, destroy 2 non-basic lands and destroy 2 creatures. That's fantastic. The part that says of an opponent's choice, I think is what sort of puts people off of this. But remember, it's stuff you don't control. So say we have one opponent with a Gaia's Cradle and one opponent with a Cabal Coffers. You pick the one opponent who's got the Gaia's Cradle to also make the choice, right? So you destroy his Gaia's Cradle. Now he gets to destroy something. He's probably going to destroy the other opponent's Cabal Coffers, right? They can't touch anything of yours. Your stuff is totally safe in this scenario. Same with creatures. You pick one creature like that Elishnorn you want off the table. Then you let another opponent pick something that you pretty much know what they're going to pick, right? There's also a Shield Dread on the table and you just know they're going to pick that. Basically, they're doing the work for you, right? And it's not anything that you control. There's no way this is bad for you, right? This is just 5 mana, destroy the 2 best non-basic lands on the board that your opponents control and the 2 best creatures that your opponents control. I think that's fantastic. Next up, Volrush Shapeshifter. 1 blue. Shapeshifter. It's an 0/1. This is a very unusual card. The art is very unusual. Again, another card that when I opened it up in packs back in the day, I just thought it was so bizarre. And the wording has changed a little bit, right? The text has changed. So as long as the top card of your graveyard is a creature card, Volrush Shapeshifter has the full text of that card and has the text, pay 2, discard a card. And then it has 2 mana, discard a card, right? So this is, harkens back to the old days of when it actually mattered the order of the cards in people's graveyards. So it's as long as the top card of your graveyard is a creature card. If the top card of your graveyard is a land, this is just going to be an 0/1 creature that does nothing. So you have to make sure that top card is a creature card. But of course, this has the ability to discard a card into your graveyard. That's pretty good, right? Right out of the gate, I just discard an Elishnorn out of my hand into my graveyard and my Volrush Shapeshifter instantaneously turns into an Elishnorn. That's pretty good. I mean, there is definitely some interesting ways to use this card. It's a very interesting card. I thought with Tortured Existence, this would be really interesting. Tortured Existence is a card that I had just mentioned in one of my last 10 cards videos, and man, what a fantastic combo here. Because Tortured Existence doesn't care about the order of your graveyard. You're just going to pull any creature out of your graveyard, right? So if you have a bunch of creatures in your graveyard, basically what you can do is with Tortured Existence, you can pitch something in your graveyard with it that you want your Volrush Shapeshifter to become, right? Then you can pull something out that you want back in your hand, but also something that maybe you want to turn your Volrush Shapeshifter into eventually, and you can just keep doing that. I mean, to me, that just seems like a really interesting deck. That's almost a deck unto itself. I have Volrush Shapeshifter and Tortured Existence, and I just have a ton of creatures in my graveyard that I can use maybe Buried Alive to put in there or whatever, and I just keep swapping them back and forth and turning my Volrush Shapeshifter into all these different creatures depending on the scenario that I want. And obviously there's lots of other stuff that discard and get stuff out of your graveyard, so there's a lot of ways you can go with this. Just a very interesting creature, very unique ability. Next up, Wake of Destruction. And I know people don't like mass land destruction in Commander typically, but this one is very interesting. 3 red, 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 so a 6 mana sorcery. Destroy target land and all other lands with the same name as that land. Again, this is not like an Armageddon where you're going to destroy all the lands. This is hating on certain lands. So this is a specific color or land type, obviously. Hate strategy. If there's a guy in your play group and he's got a mono green deck where he ramps like crazy and casts a giant Genesis wave and you're sick and tired of it, this is destroy target forest and all other lands with the same name as that, which are all the forest, right? This is going to be 6 mana. I destroy all the forest, or I destroy all the islands. You can just pay 6 mana and destroy a Gaia's Cradle. And hey, maybe you have a couple of guys in your playgroup that like playing Gaia's Cradle. You can destroy all of them with this. So that's pretty good. But typically you're going to use this to destroy all islands, destroy all forests. Is that casual strategy? I don't know. I mean, I make these suggestions and people can do what they want with them. So there it is. Coming in at number 6, Wake the Dead. And this is a card. It's from a Commander set, Commander 2014 again. I mean, that's an old set now, right? That was, geez, 7 years ago. Whew. I mean, this card was brand new when I first started playing Commander. A lot of newer Commander players might not have ever seen it, and I really like it a lot. I mentioned it a couple of times. I have it a couple of my different decks. Black, black, and X instant. Okay, but you can only cast it during combat on an opponent's turn, so that limits it a little bit. You return X target creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you sacrifice those creatures at the beginning of the next end step. So a couple of important things to note here. I think typically what this card is supposed to be used for is I throw a bunch of creatures in play as blockers, like surprise blockers. Okay, I mean, that's a good play. It is X target creature cards. Doesn't matter the CMC here, right? This is not certain converted mana cost. This is any creatures. I can get 3 10-drops out of my graveyard if I want for only 5 mana. That's pretty good. What I really like about this card is the fact that you can reuse ETB creatures and also reuse dies effects, right? It does both of those things because it has sacrificed those creatures at the beginning of the end step, which is typically not what cards like this are doing. So for example, a Solemn Simulacrum, just as an example, I bring my Solemn Simulacrum from my graveyard back into play, I go get a land, and then at the end step, or I could even chump with it if I want to. Otherwise, it just dies at the beginning of the next end step, and because it's dying, it's being sacrificed, I get to also draw a card. And then, you know, once you start multiplying that effect, if you're in any deck in black that has lots of effects like that, my Rona deck, for example, is one that I have this card in where I have lots of ETB creatures and I can bring 4 or 5 of them back all at once, get all of those triggers, get some dice triggers while I'm at it. Next up, War Cadence, 2 and a red enchantment. Another card printed in a very early Commander set, originally from Mercadian Masks though. X and red. This turn, creatures can't block unless their controller pays X for each blocking creature they control. Another card that I used to see a lot in, you know, like Krenko deck, stuff like that. So basically how this works is you're going to pay X in red. So let's say it's 1. So I pay 1 in a red, so 2 mana. This turn, creatures can't block unless their controller pays 1 for each of those blocking creatures. So you attack with your swarm of creatures, right? This is sort of like a reverse Ghostly Prison. I'm going to attack with all my goblin tokens or whatever. And each one of those goblin tokens, my opponent has to pay 1 in order to block it. And you can make this as big as you want, right? This can be 5 in red. So this can be 6 mana. Now every time my opponent wants to block with one of their creatures, they have to pay 5. So just a great card in an aggro deck. Again, I used to see it, when I first started playing. It really has disappeared. Not a lot of people play it anymore. Speaking of which, War Tax, 2 and a blue enchantment, and this is sort of the blue version of that, again from Mercadian Masks. This one was never printed in a commander set though. It was only printed in Mercadian Masks. X and a blue. This turn, creatures can't attack unless their controller pays X for each attacking creature they control. So this is essentially the reverse version of War Cadence. This basically is a ghostly prison. The only thing is you have to do it before attackers are declared. Again, you're going to pay, say, 1 and a blue. This turn, creatures can't attack unless their controller pays 1 mana for each of those attacking creatures. And again, you can do this for like 4 or 5 or whatever mana and basically lock your opponent. Like they're just not going to be able to attack at all. Next up, Warping Worm, 2 green blue. Worm, 1/1. And this is a really interesting one. It has phasing, again, another phasing card. At the beginning of your upkeep, Warping Worm phases out unless you pay 2 green and a blue. Whenever Warping Worm phases in, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So I have this on the list for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is a extremely nostalgic card for me. This is the first multicolored card I ever opened up in a pack. I really was blown away by it. Like just those old gold borders, I just thought they really looked expensive and it looked fancy and it really kind of blew me away when I first saw it. Not really a great creature. Like I tried to put this in a deck, but it really isn't very good, right? It has phasing. So a phasing creature will phase in or out at untap. So basically what happens is at the start of your turn, right when the untap phase happens, this will phase out the first time you play it. So right away you can't use it. Your next turn, it's going to phase in on untap. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, you can pay 4 or it's going to phase out again. So it basically has this upkeep that you have to pay if you want it to stay in play. But whenever it phases in, you're putting a counter on it. So it's going to phase in, and then if you don't pay the 4, it's going to phase out again. But now it's got a counter on it. Then the next turn, same thing. It's going to phase in, and if you don't pay the 4, it just put a counter on itself, but it'll phase out again. So now it's a 3/3. I thought this was a really fun inclusion in a Pure and Toothy deck because when it phases in, it's going to get 2 counters on it because of your peer, right? Your peer is going to put 2 counters on it. So really this card is actually pretty good in that deck because it's going to get big pretty darn fast. Every time, again, on your untap, it's going to phase in quickly, put 2 counters on itself, and then immediately phase out, right? And it's going to be protected from all the board wipes. Remember, phasing really has some huge upside. So there's going to be board wipes going on, and your opponents have almost no time whatsoever to try to get this thing off the table, right? They have between your untap and your upkeep to try to remove this thing before it phases out again. So it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and collecting these counters. And then eventually it gets to the point where it's like a 10/10 or a 20/20 or whatever, however long you want to let it keep phasing out. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you do pay the 2 green blue, and then you can swing with it, right? I just think it's a really fun include in a deck like that. And lastly today, Wave of Terror. And I just mentioned this card in my Felisa deck tech. 2 and a black enchantment. Cumulative upkeep, 1 mana. At the beginning of your draw step, destroy each creature with mana value equal to the number of age counters on Wave of Terror. They can't be regenerated. So a lot of cards like this one, that they sort of change the rules with cumulative upkeep. And this is a card I think that has, because of the rules change, it has benefited it in a way. So now you can use it. So this is going to be a board wipe every turn, right? So you're going to put it in play. It's going to do nothing. And then on your following turn, you're going to pay the upkeep, right? You're going to pay 1. And then at the beginning of your draw step, so immediately after your upkeep, it's going to destroy all the 1 drops on the table, right? All the 1 CMC or 1 mana value, I guess, creatures in play. And then the next turn, you'll pay the 2, and then it'll destroy all the 2s, and so on and so forth. Where I think this card is great, though, and why I put it in the Felisa deck, is because it doesn't destroy tokens, okay? Wave of Terror skips over the 0 CMC. Because you're going to play it, and it triggers on your draw step, your next turn, you're immediately going to put a counter on it, and then it's going to, on your draw step, destroy all the 1s. So it skips over the 0 CMC. So any deck where you have lots of tokens, I think for a token deck, it's a really good include. include because it skips over the token creatures and is just destroying everything else. Just a very interesting, unique card. Again, it's an enchantment. It's destroying creatures. It could be good in any deck where you just want to be destroying creatures all the time and getting dice triggers. It could be good in any deck where you're just hating on creatures in general. You know, it's kind of interesting when you have a card like this in play and people sort of have to play around it because they're like, okay, well, I'm not going to play my 3-drop because then it's immediately just going to die on their next draw step, right? It just makes for an interesting game and it makes your opponents think a little bit more instead of just running stuff out there, right? Just a really fun, interesting card. Great in Commander. That's what these lists are all about. Cards that I think are interesting includes in your Commander decks. And that is it for today. Thanks for tuning in.